Hi everyone. Before this story unfolds, take a breath with me for just a few seconds, because what you're about to hear is not just a story about power, money, or revenge. It is a story about erasure, about being underestimated, about what happens when a black woman is seen as invisible in rooms she helped build. If stories of quiet strength, delayed justice, and unstoppable rise move you, then pause for a heartbeat, show your love by liking and subscribing, and step fully into this world. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where underestimation is always the enemy's greatest mistake. This story begins in a glass building that reflected the sky so perfectly it made people believe greatness lived inside by default. The kind of building where elevators whispered success and the hallways smelled like ambition polished with privilege. For years she had walked through those doors before sunrise and left long after the city lights came on. Her work had fingerprints on every major project, her strategy embedded in systems others took credit for, her patience mistaken for submission. She had learned early that excellence did not always come with acknowledgement, especially when excellence wore her skin. Her role had never matched her contribution. She carried responsibilities heavier than her title, solved problems above her pay grade, and saved initiatives that would have collapsed without her intervention. Performance reviews glowed with praise. Metrics proved her impact, and yet promotions passed her by like trains she was never meant to board. She was always told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. And for a long time she did because she believed skill would eventually outrun bias. That belief cracked open one evening when she stayed late to finish a report meant for executives who rarely knew the names of the people who made their numbers shine. The office had emptied, lights dimmed automatically, and the hum of the building felt almost intimate. As she moved through a corridor adjacent to a closed conference room, she slowed without knowing why. Something about the weight in the air felt wrong, like truth pressing against glass. What she absorbed in that moment was not meant for her ears, but it settled into her bones with devastating clarity. Decisions about her future were being made without her presence, without her humanity, and without respect. The reason she had been circling the same position for years had nothing to do with readiness, leadership, or merit. It was rooted in something older, uglier, and deeply familiar. In that quiet hallway, her patience finally met its limit. She did not cry. She did not shake. What happened instead was far more dangerous. She became calm. Somewhere between that corridor and the parking garage, something ancient woke up inside her. Not anger that burns fast and dies young, but the kind that sharpens the mind and steadies the hand. The kind that remembers every dismissal, every overlooked contribution, every smile that masked disrespect. She understood then that the system was never designed to reward her loyalty. It was designed to extract it. But here's what no one in that room knew. While they were busy deciding her ceiling, she had already been building a ladder far beyond it. Her nights had not been empty. They had been strategic. While others attended networking events that congratulated themselves, she studied balance sheets, investor patterns, and ownership structures. She understood the company not just as a workplace, but as an organism, vulnerable and human in its flaws. She noticed the quiet tension among stakeholders, the dissatisfaction masked by dividends, the cracks hidden behind quarterly success. Months earlier she had been approached indirectly by individuals who saw what leadership failed to recognize. They did not see her as a risk. They saw her as an answer. Conversations began discreetly, always professional, always careful. She never rushed them. She knew timing was everything. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing perspectives, understanding leverage, mapping power. What made her dangerous was not ambition alone. It was preparation. She understood that ownership was the only language this world respected fluently. Titles could be denied. Promotions delayed. Credit stolen. But ownership rewrote reality. Ownership decided who sat at the table and who served it. At work the next day, nothing about her demeanor changed. She delivered results with the same precision, nodded in meetings where her ideas were repackaged, and smiled when praised for being dependable. Dependability, she had learned, was often code for controllable. And she allowed them to believe she was both. Inside, however, a countdown had begun. The company was approaching a moment of vulnerability. Market shifts, investor fatigue, and overconfidence at the top had aligned into a perfect opening. She knew this because she had studied it from every angle. She knew who was nervous, who was ready to exit, and who was waiting for a leader bold enough to reshape the future rather than protect the past. And she was ready. What hurt the most was not the denial itself. It was the audacity of underestimating her in a space built on her labor. It was the comfort with which they dismissed her value while depending on it daily. But pain, when refined, becomes power. And she refined it meticulously. She stopped thinking about revenge in emotional terms. This was not about humiliation or confrontation. This was about transformation. About rewriting the hierarchy so completely that explanations would no longer be required. She did not want an apology. She wanted control. As days passed, the building remained unaware that its foundation was shifting. Meetings were scheduled. Reports were filed. Decisions were made by people who believed the future would resemble the past. They did not realize they were already living on borrowed time. The woman they thought they had boxed in was, in fact, standing outside the box entirely, holding the deed. And as the week drew to a close, final confirmations arrived quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. No announcement yet. No disruption. Just signatures, approvals, and inevitability. The next morning would look ordinary to everyone else. But for her, it would be the moment the world finally learned what happens when a black woman stops asking for permission and starts collecting receipts. Morning arrived dressed in routine, the kind that lulled people into believing nothing significant ever happened without warning. The building woke up the same way it always did, with elevators climbing obediently and security doors unlocking on schedule. Coffee brewed. Screens lit up. Assistants organized calendars. No one sensed the quiet shift already written into the bones of the day. She entered the building with the same steady pace she had always carried, heels echoing softly against polished floors that had never truly belonged to her. Heads nodded in passing, some friendly, some indifferent, none suspicious. To them she was still a fixture of reliability, the woman who handled crises quietly and never disrupted the hierarchy. They did not know that hierarchy had already been dismantled on paper hours earlier. Her posture carried something new, though subtle enough to escape casual notice. It was not arrogance, not defiance, but certainty. The kind that settles into the shoulders when one no longer fears consequences. Fear had been replaced by clarity, and clarity made her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Every step felt like crossing a threshold that could never be uncrossed. As she reached her floor, the familiar hum of productivity surrounded her. Screens flashed data she had helped design. Processes ran smoothly because she had optimized them. The irony of it all pressed gently against her awareness. This place had thrived on her intellect while refusing to elevate her presence. That contradiction was about to collapse. The acquisition had been finalized before dawn. Investor confidence had been secured quietly, methodically, and with precision. No grand announcements were made overnight, no press releases leaked. Power did not need noise when it had inevitability on its side. The signatures existed. The transfers were complete. Ownership had shifted like tectonic plates beneath the surface, invisible until the quake arrived. She settled into her chair and opened her laptop as if nothing had changed. Emails waited. Tasks demanded attention. And she completed them with the same excellence that had always defined her work. Not because she needed to prove herself anymore, but because discipline was part of her identity. Power did not erase her values. It amplified them. Around her, assumptions persisted. People assumed she was still waiting, still hoping, still grateful to be included at all. They mistook her silence for acceptance rather than strategy. In truth, she was observing them from a place far above their projections, watching how people behaved when they believed they were untouchable. Mid-morning meetings unfolded without disruption. Decisions were made that would soon be irrelevant. Plans were drafted that would be revised by the end of the day. It was fascinating, almost surreal, to witness leadership operating under an expired reality. They spoke with authority, unaware that authority had already changed hands. What made the moment powerful was not shock value but contrast. The contrast between how they had treated her yesterday and how they would be forced to see her tomorrow. Between who they believed controlled her future and who actually did. Between the narrative they told themselves and the truth that was about to surface. She reflected briefly on the long nights, the overlooked contributions, the quiet sacrifices. None of it felt wasted now. Every experience had sharpened her understanding of the system she was about to reshape. She knew its weaknesses because she had been crushed against them. She knew its strengths because she had reinforced them. That knowledge was priceless. By late morning, Subtle signals began to ripple through the building. Unscheduled calendar changes. Executive assistants whispering with furrowed brows. Legal teams moving with unusual urgency. Something was happening, though no one could quite name it yet. The air thickened with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. She watched it all unfold with composed detachment. The formal transition was scheduled for early afternoon. That was when the truth would become undeniable. Until then, she remained exactly where they expected her to be, fulfilling expectations that no longer applied. It was a quiet act of defiance, allowing them to underestimate her for the last time. When the time arrived, it did not come with fireworks. It came with documentation, authority, and finality. Emails were sent. Access permissions changed. Chains of command were updated. And suddenly, without drama, the building belonged to someone new. Belonged to her. The realization hit different people in different ways. Confusion spread first, then disbelief, then panic. The story they had told themselves about who deserved power collapsed under the weight of reality. They searched for explanations that would preserve their worldview, but none could undo what had been legally, financially, and strategically secured. She stood and walked through the halls again, this time not as a contributor hoping to be seen, but as the architect of the future. The walls seemed different now, not because they had changed, but because she had. The space no longer felt conditional. It felt claimed. There was no triumph in her expression, no need to gloat. This was not about revenge fueled by bitterness. This was about correction. About restoring balance in a system that had thrived on exclusion. She had not taken something that was not hers. She had taken back what had always been earned. People looked at her differently now, some with awe, others with fear, others with sudden respect that arrived far too late. Their perceptions shifted rapidly, desperately trying to align with the new reality. But she did not need their validation anymore. Ownership had replaced approval. She thought about the woman she had been when she first entered this building years ago, hopeful and unaware of the quiet rules that governed advancement. That woman had survived. The woman standing here now had evolved. She carried every version of herself forward, not as baggage but as foundation. As the day drew toward its end, one truth became clear. Power exposed character. The same people who had dismissed her worth now scrambled to redefine their relationship to it. And she watched carefully, filing away behaviors, intentions, and loyalties. Leadership, she knew, was not just about authority. It was about discernment. The building settled into a new rhythm, tentative and uncertain. The future was no longer predictable, and that frightened those who benefited from predictability. But change was necessary. Growth always disrupted comfort. She left the office that evening with the same calm confidence she had carried all day. Tomorrow would bring challenges, resistance, and confrontation. But tonight marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. They had tried to deny her a promotion. Instead, they had handed her the keys. The morning after the transition arrived heavier than the last, weighted not by uncertainty but by expectation. Power, once claimed, does not linger in celebration. It demands action. The building greeted her differently now, not because it had learned respect overnight, but because authority had a way of recalibrating behavior. Doors opened faster. Conversations paused when she passed. Eyes followed with curiosity sharpened by calculation. She felt none of the thrill people imagine accompanies victory. Instead, there was focus. Leadership, she knew, was not about proving dominance but about dismantling dysfunction. And dysfunction thrived where fear, favoritism, and silence had been allowed to rule. Her first hours were spent observing rather than commanding. Ownership granted her the luxury of patience. She studied how people responded to the shift in power, who adapted with professionalism and who reacted with entitlement masked as concern. Crisis reveals truth, and truth was exactly what she needed. The executive floor, once a place where her voice had barely echoed, now awaited her direction. She walked through it slowly, not out of hesitation but intention. Every office represented decisions that had shaped the company's culture, for better or worse. She carried with her an intimate understanding of what had been broken and who had suffered quietly under it. Resistance did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through subtle gestures, delayed responses, and carefully worded objections. Some could not reconcile the image they held of leadership with the woman standing before them now. Others feared exposure, knowing the systems they had protected would not survive scrutiny. She anticipated this. Change, especially when led by someone who had once been dismissed, threatened more than profits. It threatened narratives. And narratives were the true currency of power. She understood that to lead effectively she would need to rewrite the story of what leadership looked like, sounded like, and stood for. Her approach was precise. She began with transparency, something the company had long avoided. Processes were reviewed openly. Metrics were shared honestly. Accountability replaced ambiguity. Where favoritism had thrived, structure was installed. Where silence had been enforced, channels were opened. This was not vengeance disguised as reform. It was justice refined by strategy. Employees who had felt invisible for years began to breathe differently. Productivity shifted from obligation to investment. For the first time, many felt seen not as replaceable parts, but as contributors to a collective future. The culture began to shift, not because she demanded loyalty but because she modeled integrity. Of course, not everyone welcomed the transformation. There were those who whispered about her leadership, framing change as instability. They questioned her decisions not on merit but on comfort. Their unease had nothing to do with outcomes and everything to do with losing unearned influence. She noted every reaction, understanding that leadership required discernment as much as decisiveness. She refused to perform softness to make others comfortable. Nor did she wield authority with cruelty. Her strength lay in balance, in knowing when to listen and when to act without apology. This equilibrium unsettled those accustomed to predictable hierarchies. As days passed, her presence reshaped the organization's identity. Recruitment shifted. Talent retention improved. Innovation accelerated. What had once been a stagnant system dependent on exploitation began to function as a living, evolving entity. And through it all she remained composed, anchored by purpose rather than ego. The most profound change, however, was internal. She no longer measured herself by proximity to approval. She did not second-guess her instincts or dilute her vision to fit someone else's comfort. Ownership had not made her fearless. It had made her honest. And honesty, she discovered, was the most disruptive force of all. The weight of leadership revealed itself in quiet moments. Late evenings spent reviewing decisions that would affect livelihoods. Early mornings preparing for conversations that would redefine careers. Power was not glamorous. It was responsibility magnified. And she carried it without complaint. Her thoughts occasionally returned to the hallway where she had overheard her fate being dismissed. Not with bitterness but clarity. That moment had been a catalyst, not a wound. It had shown her the cost of waiting for validation in a system built to deny it. She had learned the lesson fully now. As the third week approached, the company faced its first real test under her leadership. A major partnership, previously considered untouchable, revealed ethical compromises she could not ignore. Maintaining it would have preserved short-term profits but violated the values she was determined to establish. The decision loomed heavy. This was the moment that would define her leadership not just in policy but in principle. Walking away from the partnership would unsettle investors and invite criticism. Keeping it would undermine everything she stood for. He did not hesitate. Integrity, she knew, was not situational. It was foundational. The choice sent shockwaves through the organization and beyond. Some praised it. Others condemned it. But what mattered was that the company's future was no longer being built on compromise disguised as pragmatism. She stood firm as the consequences unfolded, trusting the long view over immediate applause. Leadership, after all, was not about pleasing everyone. It was about building something worth sustaining. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. She was not just owning the company. She was redefining it. Backlash never announces itself honestly. It disguises its arrival as concern, as market analysis, as whispered warnings about stability and reputation. By the time the resistance became visible, it had already organized itself behind polite smiles and carefully chosen language. The decision she had made in defense of integrity had done more than disrupt a partnership. It had exposed fault lines long hidden beneath the company's polished surface. External pressure arrived first. Analysts questioned her leadership with thinly veiled skepticism. Headlines danced around her qualifications without ever naming the bias that fueled their doubt. The same decisiveness that would have been celebrated in others was framed as recklessness in her. The narrative began to shift, subtly but deliberately, attempting to shrink her authority through implication rather than evidence. She noticed everything. Internally, the tension deepened. Some executives struggled to adjust to a culture where accountability applied equally. Others tested boundaries, hoping to reclaim influence through resistance disguised as compliance. Meetings became battlegrounds of ideology, where the old guard clung to tradition and she pushed toward transformation. What none of them understood was that she had already paid the price of being underestimated. There was no fear left to extract from her. She addressed challenges head-on, not with defensiveness but with clarity. Data backed her decisions. Vision framed her direction. She refused to be pulled into emotional warfare designed to destabilize her leadership. Instead, she remained anchored, knowing that reaction was what her critics desired most. The cost of standing unbroken revealed itself in isolation. Leadership narrowed her circle. Trust became selective. She could feel the weight of every choice pressing into the quiet moments of her day. There were no shortcuts through responsibility, no applause loud enough to silence doubt entirely. But she did not falter. She reminded herself why she had stepped into ownership in the first place. Not to replicate the same systems that had excluded her, but to dismantle them. Not to seek revenge but to create space for fairness. Every criticism became confirmation that change was actually happening. Employees watched closely. They saw how she absorbed pressure without deflecting it downward. They saw how she protected the company's values even when doing so came at personal cost. Slowly, trust solidified not because she demanded loyalty, but because she demonstrated consistency. The backlash intensified when financial forecasts temporarily dipped. Critics pounced, eager to attribute fluctuation to her leadership rather than long-standing structural issues. The narrative attempted to paint her as the problem rather than the reformer. She countered not with defensiveness but with long-term strategy. She invested in people. Training programs expanded. Mentorship pipelines opened. Leadership diversity became not a slogan but a measurable priority. The company began to reflect the world it served rather than the narrow image it had once upheld. And with each change, resistance weakened, exposed as fear rather than foresight. She did not shy away from hard conversations. Those who clung to power without accountability were confronted with truth. Some adapted. Some exited. The company became lighter, more agile, less burdened by ego-driven leadership. Progress demanded pruning. The most telling moments came when success returned, slowly at first, then with undeniable momentum. Innovation surged. New partnerships formed, aligned with the company's revised values. Markets responded not to noise but to substance. The very critics who had questioned her now scrambled to revise their tone. She observed it all with steady composure. Vindication was not loud. It arrived quietly in metrics and outcomes. In the relief of employees who no longer feared retaliation for honesty. In the strength of a culture that rewarded contribution rather than conformity. There were moments when exhaustion crept in, when the weight of responsibility pressed heavy against her resolve. In those moments she remembered the hallway, the dismissal, the assumption that she would never rise beyond her assigned place. That memory no longer hurt. It fueled her. Standing unbroken did not mean standing untouched. It meant choosing purpose over comfort again and again. It meant allowing criticism to sharpen rather than shatter. It meant trusting that integrity, though costly, always paid dividends in the end. As the company stabilized under her leadership, something remarkable happened. The narrative began to shift not because she demanded it but because reality forced it. Success silenced doubt more effectively than argument ever could. She had weathered the storm without compromising herself. And as the fourth quarter closed, a realization settled deep within the organization and beyond. This was not a temporary disruption. This was a new era. She was not just surviving the backlash. She was outlasting it. Legacy does not arrive with fanfare. It settles slowly, deliberately into the structures left behind when noise fades. By the time the company entered its next year under her ownership, the question was no longer whether she belonged in power. That debate had expired, starved by results, discipline, and vision that refused to bend. The only question left was how deeply her leadership would reshape what power meant. The company stood transformed, not in ways that could be captured by a single headline, but in the daily lived reality of those within it. Systems that once favored proximity over performance had been dismantled. Opportunity no longer hid behind coded language and unspoken rules. People rose because they earned it, because they were prepared, because they were seen. And she watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She never needed applause to validate her journey. Her fulfillment came from watching others step into rooms without shrinking, without apologizing for their brilliance. The culture she had built was not perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, she believed, was the strongest foundation any institution could stand on. Those who once questioned her leadership now cited her strategies. The same voices that had doubted her capacity spoke her name with respect, careful now, aware that the world had changed. She did not take pleasure in their reversal. Vindication had never been her goal. Transformation had. What she had done reached beyond profit margins. She had rewritten a narrative that had long limited Black womanhood to endurance rather than authority. She had proven that survival was not the highest form of success. Ownership was. In private moments, she reflected on the version of herself that once waited for permission. That woman had not been weak. She had been patient in a world that demanded twice the effort for half the recognition. But patience, she had learned, was not meant to be endless. There came a time when waiting became surrender. And she had chosen differently. The company now stood as evidence of that choice. New leaders emerged under her mentorship, leaders who understood that power was not about dominance but stewardship. That authority carried responsibility. That equity was not charity but strategy. The ripple effect extended beyond the organization, influencing industry conversations and challenging long-held assumptions. Her presence at the helm changed expectations everywhere she went. She did not fit the image they had been taught to anticipate, and that was precisely the point. The throne had never been broken. It had simply been guarded by narrow imagination. She expanded it. The hallway where her fate had once been dismissed still existed, unchanged in structure but transformed in meaning. It no longer represented limitation. It represented ignition. A reminder that moments meant to diminish could become catalysts for elevation. She understood now that revenge was never about retaliation. True revenge was liberation. It was thriving in spaces that once sought to erase you. It was building systems so strong that exclusion became impossible. And in doing so, she had not just claimed a company. She had claimed a future. Her story traveled far beyond the walls that once confined her. It lived in the confidence of women who stopped asking for permission. In the resolve of those who realized that being underestimated was often an advantage. In the understanding that power, when held with integrity, could heal rather than harm. This was not a fairy tale ending. There were still challenges ahead, still resistance in other forms. But she faced the future unafraid, grounded in the knowledge that she had already conquered the hardest battle, believing she was worthy of more. The world would continue to test her. Systems would resist change. But she had learned something irreversible. No one could ever deny her place again. Because she no longer asked for one. She had become the standard. And as the chapter closed on this journey, one truth remained undeniable. When a Black woman rises into ownership, she does not just take a seat at the table. She rebuilds it.